Everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Hal Lavinka, and I'm the event director of the bookstore, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to be collaborating again with our friends at NYRB Classics and the Ballot to present a discussion of Anna Seghers' classic novel Transit with Madeleine Schwartz and Edwin Frank. While the pandemic has taken a toll on in-person events, virtual programs like the one you're about to see have become the lifeblood of our industry. And I want to give a huge thanks to Madeleine and Edwin for joining us tonight. So to some housekeeping before we get started, you should all be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have a question, please click on the Q&A button here at the bottom of your screen to submit it. We'll try to get through as many of those as we can at the end of the program. There's also a chat button down here where I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, as well as some other relevant links to subscribe to the Ballot and otherwise. A caveat for tonight's event: we are all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please do bear with any technical issues that might arise. We will try to solve those quickly. And we will be continuing our virtual event series across all of the fall, so head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. Later this month, on September 24th, our NYRB Classic series continues with Jhumpa Lahiri and Cynthia Zarin discussing Natalia Ginsburg's Valentino and Sagittarius. Registrations for that event are live now, so please do go over to our website and sign up. So now a little about tonight's participants, and we can get started. Madeleine Schwartz is a writer and editor. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The London Review of Books, and The New York Review of Books, where she worked as an editor for several years. Her article, The End of Atlanticism, Has Trump Killed the Ideology That Won the Cold War?, won the 2019 European Press Prize. She is the creator and editor of The Ballot. And Edwin Frank is the founder and editor of the NYRB Classic series and the author of a book of poems, Snake Train. So Edwin and Madeleine, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Hal, and thanks to Community Books for going on hosting this series of readings and discussions, and thanks, Madeleine, for participating in this one.
Thank you.
And thank everybody out there whom I can't see for joining us. So tonight we're going to be talking about a novel by Anna Seghers, Transit, that we published a few years ago, one of two novels we published by Anna Seghers. Seghers was born in 1900 as Nettie Reisling from a wealthy Jewish family which sold art and antiquities. She early on in her life became a communist, certainly went to the left and left Germany in 1934. She then published the other book we published by her, The Seventh Cross, which is a kind of thriller about seven political prisoners escaping from a German concentration camp. That was this was in the late 1930s. It was a book that brought early news of the penal system the political penal system and genocidal political system that Hitler was setting up in Germany, though in fact that book is totally focused on political prisoners. It doesn't have any connection to the Jewish problem. And that book was a great bestseller. And then in 1939, Seghers had been living in Paris. In 1940, went to Marseille and spent some time in Marseille, waiting to go to, as she eventually did, Mexico, where she wrote the book we're going to talk about tonight, Transit, which was first published in, I believe, 1944 in English and Spanish, not in her native German. After the war, Seghers went back to Germany in 1948, and then she actually she stayed in East Germany, or she went to East Germany. And as a consequence, her career as a writer in the West basically ground to a halt, though she was a very celebrated writer in East Germany. But it's interesting that we include in our edition of Transit as an afterword a piece by Heinrich Böll from 1962, which was when finally the book was published in Germany. And it's clear from Böll's comments that publishing her in West Germany was considered a kind of provocation. It was a difficult thing to do. Anyway, she died in 1983. She, in some ways, was compromised by her relationship to the East German government. At the same time, she was also a mentor for important East German writers like Christa Wolf, and upheld a sense of literature as something not entirely not as literature as something other than pure propaganda. And certainly she was not a socialist realist in any simple-minded sense of the term. The book Transit, which was published, as I said, in English translation first in the 40s, but was retranslated for us by the wonderful translator Margot Bedauer-Dembo, tells the story of a 27-year-old unnamed man, or actually the 27-year-old unnamed man tells his story in the book. He is a German who was put into a political camp in Germany, has escaped from it to France, and at the beginning of the war is imprisoned as something between a enemy alien and a soldier defending France. When the Germans occupy France, he escapes from the French camp he's been in, and heads south to Marseille. And the book unfolds over about 17 months, mostly in Marseille. Along the way, when he's in Paris, he is asked to deliver a letter to a German exiled writer, and on coming to the hotel where the writer is said to be staying, discovers that the writer has killed himself. He takes the writer, the woman who runs the hotel has managed to dispose of the body, but she doesn't want anything to do with the suitcase or the leftovers that might be the other possessions of the writer. And so the protagonist ends up taking those off, and those possessions include the draft, an unfinished draft of a novel, and some letters to his wife, or letter from his wife, 2 letters from his wife, one of which says, "I'm leaving you," and the other which says, "Come quickly, come immediately to Marseille." What happens is that once the protagonist gets to Marseille, he goes to the Mexican consulate, which has granted the dead novelist a visa to go to Mexico, and he is confused. The consulate assumes that he is indeed the novelist, and that the novelist's name is simply a pseudonym that he used. And this leads to a situation where the novelist's wife is in Marseille and keeps being told that people have seen her husband, whom she is perpetually looking for. And slowly but surely, or at a certain point in the book, the young man realizes that, of course, what they're seeing is him. And she, meanwhile, of course, did not recognize him as her husband. And a relationship develops between him, her, and the doctor with whom she is traveling and who is her lover at the moment. I'm not going to tell you how it works out, but that's the sort of setup. Madeleine and I are going to read 2 little sections to give you a sense of this book, which has a very distinctive tone, which Margot captured wonderfully. It's a pity that Margot died a year ago, and it's a pity that she can't be here too, because I think she did a pretty formidable job with this in translating this book. And so I'll read first, and then Madeleine, and then we'll go on to a discussion. I'm getting to the most important part now. I remember the date. It was November 28th. My second residence permit was about to expire. I brooded about what to do. Should I go back? I went instead to the Mont Vertu. Back then, I went there 4 or 5 times a week. The Mont Vertu is at the corner of the Quai de Belge and the Canebière. The light that day was bright and clear, and it lightened my mood and everything else that afternoon, even the most useless and unimportant detail of my unimportant and useless existence. Nothing foreshadowed what was to come. The section of the Mont Vertu I was sitting in was right on the Canebière, and from where I sat, I had a view of the old harbor. A small gunboat was anchored by the Quai de Belge across the street. Over the heads of the people filling the cafe with their smoke and chatter, I could see its gray smokestacks among the slender masts of the fishing boats. The afternoon sun hung in the sky above the fort. I wondered if the mistral had started blowing again, for the women passing by on the street had pulled up their hoods, and the faces of the people coming through the revolving door were tense from the wind as well as their worries. No one paid any attention to the sun above the sea, the crenellations of St. Victor's Church, or the nets spread out to dry along the whole length of the pier. They talked without pause about their transit visas, their expired passports, the 3-mile zone, and the dollar exchange rate, about exit visas, and again and again and again about transit visas. I was disgusted. I felt like getting up and leaving. Then my mood changed. Why? Who knows what causes these mood changes? Suddenly, I no longer thought all the chit-chat was disgusting. It seemed fascinating now. It was the age-old harbor gossip, as ancient as the old port itself and even older. Wonderful, ancient harbor twaddle that's existed as long as there's been a Mediterranean Sea. Phoenician chit-chat, Cretan and Greek gossip, and that of the Romans. There was never a shortage of gossips who were anxious about their berths aboard a ship and about their money, or who were fleeing from all the real and imagined horrors of the world. Mothers who had lost their children, children who had lost their mothers, the remnants of crushed armies, escaped slaves, human hordes who had been chased from all the countries of the earth and having at last reached the sea, boarded ships in order to discover new lands from which they would again be driven, forever running from one death toward another. Ships must always have been anchored here at this very place, because this is where Europe ends and the sea begins. There's always been an inn at this spot because it was on the road that led to the juncture of land and sea. I felt ancient, thousands of years old. I'd experienced all this before, but I also felt very young and eager for all that was yet to come. I felt immortal, yet this feeling soon faded. It was too strong a feeling for one so weak. I was overcome by despair and homesickness. I mourned my 27 wasted years that had vanished in foreign lands. Someone at the next table was telling about a ship, the Alesia, headed for Brazil, which had been stopped by the British in Dakar. Since there were French officers on board, all the passengers ended up in an African detention camp. How cheerful the teller of this tale sounded. Probably because just like him, these people couldn't get where they were going either. I'd heard this story countless times. Oh, deadly dull gossip. I longed for a simple song, for birds, for flowers. I longed for my mother's voice, the voice that had scolded me when I was a boy. The sun disappeared behind Fort Saint-Nicolas. It was 6 o'clock. Casually, I looked over the heads of the people toward the revolving door. It was turning again. A young woman entered. What should I tell you about her? I can only say she entered. The man who committed suicide on the Rue de Vaugirard would have expressed it differently. Don't expect me to describe her. I can only say she entered. That afternoon, I couldn't have told you whether she was blonde or brunette, a woman or a girl. She entered. She stopped and looked around. There was an expression on her face of tense expectancy, almost of fear, as if she hoped and yet was afraid to find someone here. Whatever she was thinking, it had nothing to do with visas. At first, she went diagonally across the part of the room I could see, the part next to the Quai des Belges. I could still see the pointed top of her hood against the large, by now gray window. I was afraid she might not come back, that there was a door in that part of the room leading outside, and that she might simply walk through it. But she returned almost at once. The look of hope, of expectation on the young face had already turned to one of disappointment. Up to now, if a woman I might have liked walked into a place but didn't come near me, I never would have begrudged the other man her attentions. I never felt I was losing something irreplaceable, but not this time. The woman walking by me at that moment was different. She'd come into the cafe, but not to find me. And that made me feel awful. Only one thing could have been worse, if she hadn't come in at all. Again, she looked carefully around the section of the room where I was sitting. She scanned all the faces, all the tables, the way children search, both thoroughly and awkwardly. Whom was she so desperately seeking? Who could cause so much anxious expectation, such bitter disappointment? I would have liked to beat up this man who wasn't there. Finally, she discovered our 3 somewhat out-of-the-way tables. Carefully, she looked at the people sitting at the 3 tables. Foolish though it might have been, for a moment, I had the feeling that I was the one she was searching for. She looked at me too, but the look was blank. I was the last one she looked at. After that, she left.
Thank you, Edwin. I'm going to read a passage that comes only a little bit later in the book. One of the things that's really striking about this book is that very little happens in it. Much of it is taken up by waiting or standing in line or thinking that someone is about to leave and then they don't end up leaving. And yet the whole reading it is an incredibly tense experience because you keep expecting something big to happen. So here's a passage where our unnamed narrator talks about waiting in line. I didn't run into the young woman again in the next few days. Maybe she had given up her futile search or found the person she was looking for. Or perhaps she was already on the high seas, possibly on that boat to Martinique, whose departure everyone had been speculating about that week. I had a feeling I'd find her again, somewhere, somehow. But even though I tried to force myself to stop expecting to see her, I always picked a seat facing the door. The stream of the departure obsessed swelled steadily hour by hour, day by day. No police raid, no decree by the préfet of Bouches-du-Rhône, not even the threat of concentration camps could keep the number of those hoping to leave from surpassing the number of people living here permanently. I considered all those who had already departed as refugees in transit. The refugees passing through this place had left behind their real lives, their lost countries. They were fleeing barbed wire of Gur and Vernay, Spanish battlefields, fascist prisons, and the scorched cities of the north. By now I knew many of their faces. No matter how alive they pretended to be, or how animated their talk about audacious escape plans, colorful outfits, visas for exotic lands, and transit visas, nothing fooled me about their plight. I was only amazed that the prefect and the other authorities and officials of the city continued to act as if the flood of departures could be dammed by mere human means. I was afraid that I might be caught up in the tide, I who still felt alive and absolutely determined to stay here. I feared I might be dragged into the stream by temptation or by an act of violence. I went to the department that dealt with foreigners who were there on a temporary basis. There was a small group of us with all sorts of visa confirmations, safe conducts, and concentration camp release certificates. A fat official looked at us as if we'd come from another planet, not just from another country. He seemed to feel that the privilege of permanent residence here applied only to individuals from his own privileged country. They sent me to another department because a residence permit with so many extensions was either illegal or would have to be changed to a limited residence permit. I found myself waiting in line at the Rue Stanislas-Laurent. You know the place. Didn't you stand there yourself in the rain and snow that terrible winter when there was a shortage of bread? Lines of people waiting for food, or actually for the right to eat it in this city. There were Czech and Polish prestataires waiting there, soldiers who seemingly no longer had any role to play. They weren't even needed as cannon fodder, since an agreement had been reached with the enemy. They were irrelevant here, and so had laid down their weapons. Armies of ragged men who, as chance would have it, had barely survived, some just pretending to be alive. But they all had to be registered. Waiting in line, I met my little orchestra conductor again. He was shivering with cold, as if he'd crept out of a grave to be registered again with the living. I found the foreign legionary from the room next to mine. I found a gypsy carrying her children in a shawl on her back. And I found myself there too, waiting with the rest of them. Of course, you're familiar with the cavernous prefecture and the horde of frizzy-haired bureaucratic goblins that work there, digging out dossiers from the walls of shelves with their little paws and red lacquered claws. And then, depending on whether you've hit a well-disposed goblin or a malicious one, you leave the cave either happy or gnashing your teeth. They gave me a magic paper, a new invitation to appear at a later date. They indicated that a general proof of departure wasn't enough, and that I would only receive a limited residence permit if I brought along specific proof that I had booked passage on the ship, the date when my ship would leave, and a transit visa, giving me permission to pass through the United States.
Thanks, Madeleine. I think it's true what you said. This is a weirdly nerve-wracking book with moods constantly changing, and with the narrator, everybody has very volatile tempers. It's perhaps worth remembering that when she wrote it, because I think she started writing it in 1942 when she just got into Mexico, the outcome of the war remained as still quite uncertain. And in some ways, this book, which is about, it seems to me that this book, which is about prolonged period of uncertainty, full of dread, and also a world full of refugees, is incredibly timely at the moment. Did it seem that way to you, or that?
Yeah, definitely. I first started rereading the book earlier in the year out of an interest of reading works from the late 30s and early 40s to see how writers were responding to those events in real time. I think sometimes when we read histories of World War II and of that period, it can kind of end up feeling like a SparkNotes version of that, where you go from big event to big event, when actually what's striking when you read diaries or other writing happening in that period is how much waiting and uncertainty there is. No one actually knows who's going to win the war, or whether the Nazis will be defeated, or anyone in their family will survive. And it's this feeling of dread that I think makes this book really powerful and really amazing, that it was written actually during Seghers' own flight, and captures a moment that is at once totally temporary in the lives of the protagonists, but feels like it could have lasted forever.
Yeah, it's almost as if they're in a kind of underworld situation. There is, but the mixture of jitteriness on the one hand, the endless, I mean, one of the problems that all the characters face is they need not only a visa to their ultimate destination, but they also need papers to go through any countries that they have to pass through in between, and they all have to be coordinated in time. And moreover, they also have to have exit permission to leave the country, to leave France. Moreover, they have to have permissions to stay in France as transient people, which they can only get if they can actually present papers showing they will be leaving France. So it's a kind of catch-22, a vicious circle that day after day they go through. And the atmosphere of jitteriness and boredom, both the practicalities of that and the impracticalities, the waiting online, as you said, but also the way in which it sort of infects their inner temper is part of it. And it's interesting that she chose to tell it. I mean, she of course had lived through this experience herself, that she chose this young man to be her spokesperson, who is in some sense making a confession. What kind of character, what do you make of his character?
Well, I think, I think it's so interesting because when the Anna Seghers of 2020 experiencing this kind of event would probably have written this as a memoir, as you say, and instead we get a pretty, I would say, unattractive narrator. He's 27, he has escaped from a camp, and is an entirely transient human. I mean, he says early on, I have no party, I have no affiliation. He is of German background, but does not associate with any of the Germans, nor does he feel especially French. He has very little by way of relations. There are occasional ex-girlfriends who crop up. But he seems in many ways to me to be someone whose entire life and personality has in some ways been kind of ground out of him by circumstance. In fact, one of the interesting refrains that comes through this book is that anytime anyone asks him his story, he says, "It had been a long time since anyone asked me where I came from," or "It had been a long time since anyone asked me about my past."
Mm-hmm. And we actually don't really ever hear anything about his past except fairly late in the book. I mean, early in the book, it's made clear that he's not a political, even though he was a political prisoner, it was not because he was affiliated with the communists or any other kind of party. He's an unaffiliated man. He mentions in the passage I read, his mother, interestingly, scolding him. He wishes to hear again, but there's almost no description of his family otherwise. He is, as you say, a kind of completely displaced person. Later on in the book, you discover that his crime had been that he had punched out an SA officer, but not just because he found the face of authority so off-putting. He's an electrical engineer, I believe, or maybe that's what Petzold turns him into in the movie. But in any case, he is a scientific person, and he is not at all a writer, which actually gives Anna Seghers. You might have something to say about why he's not a writer and what that allows her to do.
Well, it's sort of ironic in a way, because throughout the book he's actually extremely dismissive of writers and very angry towards them. There are two passages that I think particularly interesting. One at the beginning of the book where he runs into an old acquaintance of his who is a writer and who had written very, very anti-Hitler attacks, and as a result has been given a certain degree of priority in this passage. And he says, why should this guy get any kind of priority to leave here, and not, you know, my friends from the concentration camp who survived much worse fates and didn't happen to be writers. And I think we were talking about one of these passages earlier when we were emailing, and I think there's a moment that seems to me almost ironic, where very late in the book, he's talking to a government official who asks him about his plans to write. You have to understand that to everyone he meets, he is not a young transient 27-year-old, but an actually quite famous German writer, because that is the identity that he's taken on in order to get these papers. And so someone asks him, well, what are you going to write about all of this? And he says, here, let me find. So he asked, what do you intend to do in the future? What are your plans? Your next professional undertaking? His look was piercing. I said, I will try to learn a trade. He said, a little surprised and with just a trace of sympathy, how come? Aren't you going to write another book? Then, under that severe gaze of his that demanded the full truth, it just burst out of me. No. Let me tell you why. As a little boy, I often went on school trips. The trips were a lot of fun, but then the next day our teacher assigned us a composition on the subject, our school trip. And when we came back from summer vacations, we always had to write a composition, how I spent my vacation. And even after Christmas, there was the composition, Christmas. And in the end, it seemed to me that I experienced the school trips, Christmas, the vacations, only so I could write a composition about them. And all those writers who were in the concentration camps with me, who escaped with me, it seems to me that we lived through the most terrible stretches in our lives, just so we could write about them, the camps, the war, escape, and flight.
Yeah, and that for Seghers, I think, is very much one of the things that's going on in this book is she is through it, in a sense, grilling herself about how can you write effectively in a time of crisis, and what should the ends of writing be. And as a consequence, one of the subtle things that goes on in the book is a slow transmogrification, a kind of transition to accompany the theme of transit, of how one perceives Weidel and his book. So though the hero is so is indifferent to writing, I mean, he says, well, he takes the manuscript and he reads it early in the book, and he says, I think it was the first book I ever read. And this is what comes as one goes along to realize that he exaggerates. Some point later in the book, somebody reproaches him for this kind of tough guy, hard-bitten things where, you know, none of this matters to me and so on. And so this is clearly a kind of exaggeration, but it certainly is depicted as the first time a book hit him. And he says that in Weidel's manuscript, there's a character, a lot of people going through a lot of complications. Again, it's sort of almost throwaway. But I recognize them, and I recognized a character kind of like me. And he then recognizes he's surprised by the power of this story to and somehow make himself feel real, which he previously did not, and which he continues to often not feel in this book. But as you go along, and the book is in a curious way, Weidel's book is unfinished, so leaves him hanging. And in a curious way, Seghers' book is the book that takes over or writes this same hanging story, or writes the story of being left hanging, because it really is a book about those sorts of things. But there is an ongoing effort to figure out what writing can or can't do, and certainly an ongoing backing away on her part, I think, from the German literary world or whatever. I mean, the portraits of writers are largely scathingly satirical, and writers are shown as the most hopeless opportunists and the people who will betray anybody at the drop of a hat, and in order for their own interest and so on too. A somewhat painful thing to think about, given that later she was accused in the DDR of betraying her associates and friends too. So it was a question she went on living with for a long, long time. There's also, I mean, so along with our what do they call it in German? He's an Ich narrator or something like that, I narrator. Along with that, there is Marie, whose still unnamed entry I read about. And then there is the doctor, and these are the main characters in the book. How did Marie strike you? Marie is, in a way, it strikes me somewhat as she's both her own person and his own projection and his projection and anyway, a complicated character, if she is even a character. But what were your senses of her?
Well, I think it's hard to, in some ways, to describe her as a character because so much of we see is his own need for her. I mean, in this underworld of Marseille, she is sort of the only, one of the few consistent presences, and he starts, as he begins to see her in these cafes, he starts to organize his life around the possibility of seeing her more, and then later it turns out that she is in a relationship with a doctor who she knows through some other people who he's met down there. But, you know, I think in some ways we get such a little sense of her. We have a sense that she sort of has this dramatic, romantic background, but otherwise is a woman with no real personality aside from the sort of men that she refracts off of over the course of the book.
Yeah, well, she's, I mean, it's interesting too that this should be the case in a novel written by a woman. I sent Madeleine earlier today there's a reference in another book that NYRB Classics publishes by Victor Seghers, his notebooks, about, he describes running into Anna Seghers in Mexico where they'd both taken refuge, but Seghers Seghers was fearing for his own life in Mexico, fearing that the KGB would come after him. And so he was, and Anna Seghers had written something denouncing Seghers and some other people actually in the American paper, in the Nation. So he's upset with her, but Seghers is a man with an amazingly open and sympathetic heart in some ways. And he describes seeing her in Marseille, and describes her as basically clearly undergoing a kind of nervous breakdown. And I wondered whether in depicting herself and suddenly stopping to scribble and write little things, and she was there with her 2 children and her husband, who was I wonder whether the way in which Marie is depicted doesn't reflect that almost sort of collapse of personality coming from a nervous breakdown in the midst of such extraordinary uncertainty and dread. And in a curious way, this book is trying to work that through almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I'm struck by a passage where she says, here, let me find it. Did I really laugh back then? I wonder how many years it's been since I actually laughed. I may be young, but look at me in the mirror over there. And she continues, I see that I still look young. How can it be that I'm still so young, so very young? How can it be that my hair is still brown? I feel 100 years have gone by since we first heard that the Germans were outside Paris. You never asked me about that. Here in Marseille, everybody asks, where are you going? They never ask, where are you from?
Yeah.
And there's a sense that so many of these characters are just exist only as people for the exact task that they need to do that day and have no inner life beyond that, in part because the circumstances just don't allow it.
Yeah, inner life has sort of been suspended like so many other things in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, and in that sense, the book is a book about ultimately her coming to a decision. I mean, the defining act of the book is her act. Well, her and his in a way, but there is a way. And as you say, though, I mean, the doctor is another one of these characters who, one of the first things that happens in the book is that in the very first section is that the narrator asks a never named, an equally unnamed interlocutor, who supposedly he's telling this whole story to throughout the book, though that convention of telling you a 200-page story soon, well, whatever is left is simply a convention. But and one of the things he comments on to begin with is the pizza he's eating, which he says as a German as somebody from Germany would say, seems a very odd dish, right? I mean, it looks like a fruit pie, but it's actually spicy and savory and exotic. And that way in which people aren't what they appear to be is a continuing theme. Is the doctor is also somebody who comes in. I mean, he assumes, having read this letter, not the doctor, sorry, the narrator, having read this letter in which Marie has said she's leaving her husband, that she's simply, it's a matter of expedience that she's hanging out with the doctor in order to get away. But again, things get more and more complicated as it goes on, and both her relationship to him and his relationship to her are slowly transformed. So it's a book about, I mean, you're right that in some ways inner life is very hard for people to feel, but it is about slowly trying to get back in touch with something like that, I think, through much of it.
Yeah, but I think it's one of the things that's so powerful about the book. You know, I was rereading bits of The Seventh Cross a few days ago, which is Seghers' other book about the period, which is also published by NYRB, and which I would encourage everyone who's here to also buy and read. And it's, you know, it's a much more heroic narrative immediately turned into a movie with Spencer Tracy, and you can see reading it why, because it's, you know, it's clear who the hero is and what he has to do, and you really are rooting for him. And I think in this book, you're really getting the psychological toll of what life is like when you have absolutely no concern over your circumstance. I mean, the characters in this book, most of what they do all day is either wait in line or get drunk and eat pizza. And that is not a way to build a very deep inner life.
We should say there's some interesting, there are sort of comic vignettes in the background. And everybody keeps thinking Weidel is alive, not least Marie, but people describe Weidel as a kind of a person who never really wanted to talk to anybody, and actually who used the other writers who are trying to use people describe him as being, but always hiding behind his newspaper, which he actually drilled holes into in order to see what was going on in the cafe while he was disguised. And at a certain point, the narrator becomes somewhat similar, and certainly the book has, along with this sort of slightly stifling and I mean, I think the reader feels, again, when somebody enters and begins to say, I didn't get this paper, I did get this paper, I didn't get that paper, you think, no, I just don't want to hear it anymore. But there are also some kind of comic characters, and there's a comic vignettes of people caught up in this terrible world, sort of Hieronymus Bosch comedy, but like the woman who has the two Great Danes.
Yeah,
others.
She's I think one of my favorite of the minor characters, and the way the novel is constructed, I think it is quite interesting, because on the one hand you have this incredibly claustrophobic, essentially threesome between the narrator Marie and the doctor, with the ghost of Weidel's presence kind of hanging in the background, and then throughout is everyone else waiting to leave Marseille, and it's a very wide-ranging and colorful cast of characters, including one woman who has been tasked with bringing two Great Danes to America, and they belong to Americans, and that's the only reason or way that she can leave France. And so every time we see her, she is very resentfully taking incredible care of these Great Danes. There's a scene where she's sort of found some kind of replacement. She's finding treats for them, and she's shampooing them and pampering them, and then we'll kind of mutter that this is only so that she can leave. She has no feelings for these dogs.
Yeah. It's like Seghers is, I mean, Seghers was a political novelist. Seghers was and certainly The Seventh Cross is deliberately written as a kind of thriller, which will also be an expose of the reigning conditions in Nazi Germany. This book is a nail biter, but not a thriller exactly. I mean, it is in some ways reminds you with the themes of boredom and the questions of loyalty. a book like Camus' The Stranger. I mean, it's funny, they're written almost at the same time, and some of the certain sense of complete suspension is shared by them. And
yeah, and I think it's also interesting reading it now, you know, the period of the war is the one that I think as readers we are taught to read in the most Manichaean sort of black and white terms of good and bad. And there's no character in the book who seems purely good and no character in the book who seems purely evil. Everyone is in this very indeterminate zone.
Yeah. And there's some big subjects that come out. I mean, there's the question of betrayal is one that comes up partly in relation to Marie basically hopping in the doctor's car to escape from Paris, leaving her husband behind. There's a question of home that is brought up. I mean, actually, we were saying that you don't have anything about what his home in Germany was like, and except for the sensible guess that he didn't really have much of a home in Germany, even though he yearns for his scolding mother. And similarly, the way in which Marie meets Weidel is equally accidental and contingent. But the idea of home haunts him. I mean, there are these themes that keep getting struck, but without ever coming quite to a resolution. I mean, there is a way which the book does try and not only depict a state of suspense, but again, I'm now, for some reason, I'm tending towards a sort of almost therapeutic reading of this book, this transit thing, that it's kind of, it's trying to think through what questions of home and betrayal and loyalty are. There is, it's a loop book, right? So, I mean, in the sense it starts in Marseille. He's telling this story. You get to the end of the story where, well, no, I guess we shouldn't go there. It's not a particularly political book, though, which is interesting for somebody who is leaving a continent for politics. It's almost more of a religious book or a spiritual book, it seems to me. But
well, I was sort of thinking about that, and I wondered to what extent that has to do with the, I kept reading this book and wondering how much she knew when writing it about the entire theater of what was going on in Europe at the time, and to what extent that really matters. I mean, certainly for the characters in the book, they are so beyond a system in which any politician is going to make a difference in their life that it's not surprising that they should have almost no interest, because in the ways that they live their lives, it's, a faceless, it's just one bureaucrat after another. And even when reading the book, suddenly you're at the Mexican consulate and you're at the American consulate. And even as a reader, you sort of start to think, well, does it even matter if I'm in the Mexican consulate or the American consulate? There's really no system in which they can.
Yeah, and at various points she says, I mean, there's also an effort to try and sort of get in touch with immemorial or eternal things, in that he contemplates throughout the oven in which the pizza is made as this sort of, which is in some sense, though he's in a cafe, it's as if he were at a kind of an artificial hearth, even though he has no hearth actually to be by. But there is, and he thinks about the kneading of the dough and so on, and tries to imagine. And equally, he looks at the American embassy and says, this could be the ancient. These officials could be officials of ancient Rome. This has been going on, and in a way will go on again and again and again. We should perhaps give people a chance to ask some questions. I think we're around that. Yeah.
Let's see. Well, this is a question for you, Edwin. Does NYRB anticipate publishing any other of Seghers' works? And I think I'll pair that with another question. Who do you think are Seghers' major stylistic influences? There's loads of Kafka, but not just.
We are publishing this coming spring a collection of her short stories, which will go from her early work, which was sort of, which is usually associated with the new objectivity, Neue Sachlichkeit in Germany, as well as a more expressionist vein, which I think you could certainly be felt in this book too, to her later stories. She was always, though this is something I hadn't really realized before. I was looking at there's a scholar at the University of Chicago, Helen Fairberry, who has written a good deal about Anna Seghers, and very interestingly, and who has drawn out her ongoing interest throughout her life in myth and mythic structures. And there's certainly a kind of Proserpina story going on here, a Persephone story going on of the woman lost in the shades. Anyway, that book is coming out. I'm not sure, there's some Kafka in this book, yes, but it's not exactly a Kafkaesque book. Maybe some Georg Heim, who's not terribly, who's an expressionist writer. And there's a little bit of Hemingway in the voice of I think there's actually a distinct amount of Hemingway in the voice of the narrator, whose hard bitterness could come out of The Sun Also Rises, really. And I would be very surprised if she hadn't read that book.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when it comes to the mythic element. I mean, we get these very sort of, and there's a question about that as well. But we get quite a number of allusions to, similar to the passage that you read of Marseille as this ancient port, and then many images of Marseille as a kind of underworld. And I recently was rereading Krista Wolf's book based on Cassandra, another East German writer who was a little bit younger than Seghers, and I couldn't help but wonder if all Germans were if it was part of their diet as children to read these myths, and that's why there are so many books that apply them to political situations, or whether it's just a stylistic question.
Well, I mean, waiting for the ferry to go across the waters, and will it be a birth or a death is sort of central to this book. And so there is an underlying mythic or symbolic, fundamental symbolic property, I think, of practically all cultures that is being engaged with here.
Yeah. All right, let's see. Madeleine, what other works from the 30s and 40s could you recommend to us, to those of us also interested in the terrifying overlap with today? Edwin, same question. And then we have a response from Lauren Goldenberg, who says, I hope they answer this, but as they speak, I am reminded of Every Man Dies Alone by Hans Fallada, which might fit the bill of what you are looking for. Well, speaking for myself, I primarily work as a journalist, so I've been actually mostly reading journalism from this period, and in particular the work of Martha Gellhorn, who was a pretty formidable war correspondent who had the misfortune of being one of Hemingway's wives, which I think really overshadowed her work as a writer. But she has, in one of her collections of writing called The Faces of War, there's a description of being in Barcelona in the, I guess, late 1930s. And in many ways, it reminds me of some of the atmosphere of this book, because on the one hand, you have terrifying violence. I mean, the prospect that the city is going to be bombed at any moment. And on the other hand, long periods of waiting, where she, as a journalist, is very upfront about describing being in this, hotel with all the other foreigners who are just, drinking and having crazy times before the next assignment. So I would recommend her work very highly.
A book that I would recommend that comes from the same era, though and is in a way very different, but is Anna Banti's novel Artemisia. Banti is Italian, and that book, it would seem she was, and the book came out in 44, 45 or 46. And it's about in a way, it's about the Baroque painter Artemisia Gentileschi. But it's also about Banti having lost the manuscript of what sounds like a conventional historical novel about Artemisia Gentileschi in the bombing of Florence as the Germans retreated, and having to start writing a book again, and having to think again and again about what kind of book will speak to the larger, what kind of book can you write to deal with the losses that history inflicts on people, the losses Artemisia had been raped, so the losses that people inflict on women, and how can one come up with a literature that will contain these unspeakable things. And in that book, she's in some sense always waiting to figure out how to write her own book, though it's not a terribly long book, and it's a beautiful book and a very lyrical book, but from the same era, approaching some of the same issues.
So if the novel is constantly placing its characters in suspension, how does Seghers maintain any feeling of forward momentum to the narrative? I think that that's part of what makes the book so successful, is that narrative and is that momentum. I mean, to me, the way that I actually spent some time before this event trying to write out what I thought the outline of the book was, and you very, very quickly, because there are so many scenes, one on top of each other, in consulate, cafe, consulate, waiting in line, it's very difficult to, you start to realize that instead of a sort of tripartite act or a series of scenes, what you're really getting is almost like a ring narrative. The book begins with the narrator in a cafe with his much beloved pizza, talking to someone about something very bad that has happened. And so you as the reader know already that there is going to be some development to the story. But as it goes on, she keeps you in suspense about when that's going to happen. And I find it actually sort of one of the things that makes the book so memorable is that you find yourself, to me, in almost the same situation as the characters, insofar as once you're in the middle of the book, caught in these lines and conflicts and visas, you realize you're too far in to ever get out without just going through. And at that point, feel yourself really propelled towards the end.
It's interesting. It's got it's a book in 10 chapters, and the chapters are subdivided, and the chapters are of irregular length, so there's an almost syncopated quality to it. It sort of throws you off balance consistently. And I found myself wondering, how do the chapters map onto the sections, and went through to sort of today to just look at the different, look at the structure. The big reveal happens, as is often the case with novels, dead center in the book, in a 250-page book at about around 125. But so there is a kind of symmetrical structure imposed on the larger thing, but otherwise you are always being slightly wrong-footed or jittery or wondering what's going to happen next and so on. So it's actually, I think, a very elegantly constructed book finally, but and a book that she knew exactly what she was doing when she finally came to write it.
Yeah. Do you know how Anna Seghers is remembered and regarded in Germany? Did her movement between East and West Berlin color the way she's now regarded?
A little bit. I'm certainly not an authority on it. I mean, she, something like The Seventh Cross, the afterword we include for that, is I think widely read and read as is sort of a canonical classic. Indeed, I can't remember the name of the German writer who wrote the afterword, but he talks about feeling that he was having it force-fed when he was a teenager in school. And the publishing house, the East German publishing house that is now, it's not a German publishing house, Aufbau, certainly has published a complete works. I mean, I think she's seen as one of the major German writers of the 20th century. And she's not the only 20th century writer to have have had to suffer and whose political profile is not perfect. Perhaps in that way, she's like most of the writers of the 20th century.
Well, and certainly she was a very strong defender of East.
Yeah.
Of East Germany, and from what I can understand, something of an East German literary power broker in her own.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so sorry.
No.
Well, we have, I guess this will be our last question, and then we can wrap up for the evening, we actually have 2 questions on the film that was made based on this book, which came out now a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. So would you comment on the Petzold film and its relationship to the novel? I would highly recommend the film, which you can find on any number of online places where films are found. And what I think it does that's very interesting is it takes the obvious parallels between what's described in the book and today's situation without ever really putting us fully in the present. We're very much caught in the kind of timeless world of Marseille that Seghers described and led to believe that it might be now just as much as it might be sometime in the past. And I think it's for that reason very, very effective.
And I think that's totally true to the book, where, I mean, as we were just saying before, the effort to say that this is a recurrent situation. And I mean, and that's another way which you could say the book is, if not political, but poses the most basic political question, which is, you know, one's always on the shore of a new or an old world, and how do you get from one to the other? And indeed, at no point do you ever conclusively get to that other shore. In some sense, you are always in transit. But in any case, the movie's depiction of it as being a kind of both now and in the past at the same time, I think is quite effective. And when I first saw it, I was quite jarred by its ending with the Talking Heads song. We're on the road to nowhere. But actually, on watching it again, I thought that was part and parcel of it too. The film is perhaps marginally more sentimental than the book, but in that the relationship between Marie and the protagonist becomes, well, it's very central to this book too. So I may be wrong about that. It's a good movie, I think.
Yeah, I agree and would strongly recommend it.
Yeah.
Well, Edwin, unless there's anything else that you
all right.
add, I think that's it for tonight. Thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Well, and thank you, Madeleine. Thank you, Edwin, for sharing that with us. This has been a project that we've been talking about doing for a while. I'm so happy we got to pull it off. And Madeleine for introducing this project idea to us. So just as a reminder, in the chat, I just posted some links again to purchase copies of Transit. Also, the other Seghers novel. So if you have any interest, please check those out. Also, a link to subscribe to the Ballot. Madeleine and her fellow editors and reporters are doing absolutely exceptional work there, especially you know, during times of crisis. So please check them out. Please consider supporting them. Absolutely subscribe to them. And otherwise, we can call that a night. And Edwin, I will see you again very soon. And we'll continue the series. And it's so much fun to be working with friends again. So
okay, thanks, Madeleine. Thanks, Hal. Thanks everybody.